Alright, here we go for reals. Okay, so anyways, I thought today that we would go over and do a little bit of a preview of the 9.21 patch, which should be coming out pretty soon. Judging from the way that most of the common test builds sort of progressed to the live server, I would guess that it's probably this upcoming week. It seems like they're sort of wrapping up the changes, and I thought we'd talk about a little bit of the changes that are going to be coming out. So there have been some changes in the British tank destroyer line, even at the lower tiers. Primarily, they've changed the top tier. The FE-183 is now the Badger, but they also made some changes to the way that the armor layouts of this tank line goes. And I'm not going to go over that too much, other than to say that they basically strengthened it a little bit so that they're not quite so weak, not so easy to snipe frontally, but that does not mean that they are difficult to snipe frontally. So those are two separate things. So we'll talk about all of the big points though, and primarily the biggest point is the removal of the FE-183 and its replacement with the Badger, and this was very similar to what was done recently with the Foch 155 and replacing it with that 50B or whatever it was called. And so they basically added the Badger to be more in line with the other tanks in the line, which is to say that they're sort of frontally armored DPM machines, as opposed to the Death Star, which is kind of weak in terms of its armor, with just having a massive alpha. And I mean, I think that makes sense given the sort of playstyle of the line. And the Badger is actually a pretty good tank, and we'll talk about why. And so the best thing about the Badger is that the guns in this line are actually pretty good for the most part. They don't have as much alpha as you've sort of come to expect from most of the tank destroyers, but they do have good DPM and good control, which does go a long way towards being an effective tank. Now we'll talk about one of the strengths, as I said, was the gun, and specifically, even though the gun doesn't have very good alpha, it does have really good control, right? It's at that 0.3 accuracy, 1.7 second aim time, which is very similar to what we had seen on the Top Gun on the Tortoise. And so the nice thing about this is that you do get like 3,500 DPM out of this gun, and that's pretty good. Now, in general, and if you listen to my stream very often, you'll know that I always say that tank destroyers have become less relevant in the meta as compared to what they once were, because they lost a lot of camo and mobility, and as well as their initial alpha. And so having a DPM tank destroyer isn't necessarily a good thing. Really, the only niche left for tank destroyers in terms of the random battle meta is in lane control. They're very good at controlling lanes, but unfortunately the meta of this game really dictates that the team that is able to flank and go around those lanes are really the ones that have the advantage to win the game. And so the strength of the tank destroyers, of these lane control tank destroyers, isn't necessarily with the way that the game is currently played, and the maps that the games are played on. So that's certainly a limitation, but we'll talk about why the Badger is still pretty good when we can do a comparison to like all the other non-turreted tank destroyers. And primarily to do that, we need to look at the armor layout, and armor typically is not super relevant in this game, but the armor on the Badger is actually pretty good. So let me bring that up. There we go, now it's up. And so this is the armor of the Badger here. I need to move it so I can see it. Okay. And the nice thing about the Badger is that frontally it's very, very solid. There's no place on it that's going to be easy to snipe. This lower glacis will be vulnerable to premium shells, top tier premium shells. So if you have a tier 10 gun, but otherwise it's still going to be, that's not going to be a great shot. And so given the fact that the Badger itself has a really good gun with really good DPM, this is not going to be a tank that you want to like face off against frontally. Like most tank destroyers, not particularly the non-turreted ones, the sides of the tanks are super vulnerable. So anytime that you can get to a flanking situation against these tanks, that's sort of what you want to do. And then again, if you are the person that's driving the Badger, you want the exact opposite. You want to try to keep everybody in a lane in front of you when at all possible. Now, this is not entirely easy in these non-turreted tank destroyers. Like, a large problem with playing the Tortoise is that it's not really fast enough to compensate for as teams move around you, and that sort of creates difficulties. But when you look at the Badger, hang on, let me bring this back. And so I just sort of did a side-by-side comparison of the Tortoise to the Badger here. And so what we're really interested in looking at here is the mobility just relative to the Tortoise, just so you can get an idea. And what you always look at when you look at these things are the sort of top speeds. You want to know both the reverse and the forward top speed, because both of those are important. The specific power and also the traverse speed. And so the traverse speed on these tanks are about the same, which is to say it's not super great, but the specific power on the Badger is much better than the Tortoise, which means that you're going to get a lot better mobility out of it, particularly when you're trying to turn and accelerate and back up and things like that. So you will have that as an advantage with the Badger. Now the Badger, like when I want to sort of, I was trying to think of sort of what you could compare the Badger to, and it's kind of like the Tortoise, but it's a little bit faster with a better gun, and it's kind of like the Object 263 in terms of the idea that the frontal armor is pretty solid. The armor on the Badger is better, but the mobility on the Badger is less than the mobility on the Object 263. But those are sort of reasonable comps for this tank. And so I think it'll be an interesting tank to play in terms of, I think it will be good at lane control, but how well are you going to be able to play it in the random battle meta? Yeah, I think that becomes a little bit more tricky. So we'll have to see. And so the other big change that's coming up in the 921 patch is the French heavies, the long-awaited French heavies. This has been talked about for probably the better part of 4 years, it was going to be a non-autoloader armored French heavy tank. So pretty much opposite of everything that you have come to expect from the French tanks, and it is very similar in a sense to the MLE, the premium tank that they released a while ago. Let me find it. This guy, in terms of the layout and the gameplay style, and that's basically that it has relatively solid armor, and we'll talk about the armor in most places and where it's weak, with a pretty decent gun. And so they actually make for pretty good heavies, as long as you can be efficient in your use of armor. And so this line will be coming off of the AMX 1945, and so it'll cost you about 60K to get to the Tier 8. And the Tier 8 is interesting, and hang on, I'm probably best to talk about this in the, well, we'll do a preview first, I guess. And so all of these tanks are sort of, as I had noted, predicated based off of their armor, and there's going to be different layouts which are going to be more important than others, in my opinion. And there was also going to be a certain playstyle, a subtle playstyle difference when you play like the Tier 8 as opposed to the Tier 9 and the Tier 10. And so I'll try to make a note of that. And so the interesting thing about the Tier 8, and this is where I'm going to start when this goes live, I'm just going to go ahead and start on the Tier 8. And the comparison that I make for the Tier 8 is that it's kind of like a T-32. It's more like the American heavy than it is what will ultimately be this the rest of this line. And that is to say that the hull of this tank is going to be relatively weak. Like this, even tier heavy guns will go through this still pretty easily. Even though it is sloped, it is not very thick. And so I'll show you that armor. And then the other thing is that so when you have the stock turret on this, and this is more like the stock turret from the Tier 7 1945 tank, right? You get 10 degrees of depression, but this cupola up here becomes a pretty significant weak point. So even though you get better depression out of it, I don't think that's something that you're going to want to do. So you're going to end up going with the top turret, and then let me just show that armor layout real quick. Okay, and so this is the Tier 8 French heavy with the stock turret on it and the top 100. And so, as I was saying, this frontal armor here, on the hull armor, is going to be relatively thin, and so a lot of guns are going to be able to go through it. And this cupola up here is also very weak. And what that does is that really hamstrings you from being hulled down in this tank. But if you use the top turret on this gun, then the top of that turret becomes much more solid, and so that becomes much more difficult to snipe, particularly at any sort of appreciable range. Now, of course, the hull is still going to be weak, which is why I sort of made the analogy of playing this tank more like a T-32, where you want to get hull down. You do lose a little bit of gun depression because when you use the top turret, you only get 8 degrees of gun depression as opposed to 10 degrees with the stock turret, but it's worthwhile to get the much more solid turret out of it. And then going back to the guns real quick, for some of these tanks, using the top gun is important, but for this particular tank, I actually think that using the top 100, the middle gun here, will actually be the better gun for most purposes, for a couple of reasons. One is that you do actually get better DPM out of it, and two is that you get better base pan out of it. It's 232. You do lose some alpha, but you get better accuracy at the cost of a little bit of aim time. And so while the guns are reasonably close, I think that playing with the top turret and the 100 as opposed to the 120, where you lose about 200 DPM, is going to be important, particularly if you can get hulled down, which is where you're going to sort of make your bread and butter here. And then we go now to the next tank, and again, this is where it becomes a little bit more like the premium Tier 8 1949 when you look at both the armor layout and also at the sort of play style of the tank. And I was trying to think of another comparison for those of you who don't have played that French premium, and it plays what I thought of was instinctively something more like the Russian IS-7 line. Where the hull is reasonably strong, and we'll go over the armor layout of that in a little bit, and it has a pretty good turret. Now, these tanks do have turret weaknesses, though. So while you can upgrade the turret to get rid of the turret weakness on the Tier 8, on the Tier 9, it's interesting that turret weakness is still there. So let's take a look at that real quick. Okay, and so this is the Tier 9 tank, and again, so now what you see is that the frontal hull here is pretty strong, right? So we're looking at, you know, depending on the angle that you're going to take at it, you know, 260 mils effective. Much like on the premium Tier 9, though, these sort of corner panels here become vulnerable. So as the tank sort of turns away from you in either direction, then these panels right here actually become very vulnerable. Now, barring that, you can still snipe this cupola up here, which is going to be a major problem for this tank. So depending on the angle that you get, it is a relatively small target, so that's something that's good, particularly on these larger tanks, where if you can get close enough to people, then they have to sort of shoot up at it, which greatly increases your ability to defend yourself. But I think that ultimately that's going to be a problem at any sort of, you know, against any sort of sniping tank. Frontally is going to be able to get that. And then the Tier 9 also has gun options, and the interesting thing about the Tier 9 gun options, and so we went with a smaller gun on the Tier 8, and I actually go with the bigger gun on the Tier 9, and we'll talk about why. So you do lose, again, a little bit of control when you upgrade to this 127 as opposed to using the 120. You have virtually the same DPM between the two, and you lose a little bit of control. And so when you compare the DPM of this tank, right? So it's 2200 using the 127, and it's like basically the same with the with the lower alpha. So you'll get better gun control if you use the 120, but I think at that point you'd rather have the extra alpha there for taking people on. Oh yeah, and the other thing that I was going to say is that these tanks they're certainly less mobile than what you sort of have come to expect out of the rest of the French tanks, because the rest of the French tanks aren't really lugging around very much armor, but they're not really like super slow. And that's a point that we'll get to when we get to the final tank as well. And then so the last tank, which is this is the tier 10. And again, you'll notice that it's pretty much the same armor layout, so it's going to have that strong frontal hull, relatively weak sides as they sort of turn away, and a little bit of a turret weakness up top. And it's very similar to the way that the tier 9 plays. Okay, and so this is the tier 10, and you'll notice again it looks exactly like what we just looked at. This is the tier 9, and this is the tier 10. Tier 9, tier 10, right? So it's pretty much the same type of armor layout. It just has slightly thicker peripherals, so like you're not going to be able to really go through this front with any sort of without any sort of high roll on your premium shell. But like as the tank turns, these corners are going to become vulnerable, and there's also this area up here which you could potentially snipe. So these are things to keep in mind when you're playing against these tanks. And similarly, this tank actually has a gun option as well. And so looking at these two gun options, I actually think that probably using the one with the lower alpha is going to be better. So using this 120 is going to be better than using this 130. And we'll talk about why a little bit. So when you look at the pen, right, you do get more pen with the 120. That's a significant amount, but that's not like a game-breaking amount for most of the tanks that you're going to be up against. But in particular, the APCR on this 120 is actually really good, right, at 315. You do get a regular AP out of the 130, which will have better normalization than the APCR, but I think that you'll probably end up being better off using this 120, because so when you look at the control is much better with the 120, and you basically lose, like, let's see, so the 130 has 2200 DPM, and so you basically lose 100 DPM by moving up to the 130. So even though you do gain that alpha, you do lose some DPM, and I think that ultimately that will cost you a little bit, because if this were like a really slow tank, like when we talk about the German heavies or the Japanese heavies, those tanks need alpha because it's not like they can really chase down tanks and create shots for themselves. Whereas these tanks aren't so immobile that that's going to be as much of an issue. And so if we look at the comparison. So as I was saying, with this tier 8, the 65 ton, this tank is going to play a little bit more like the American heavies, whereas the 9 and the 10 are going to play more like the Russian heavies, right? So the tier 8 is more about finding a place where you can hold down, and the tier 9 and the tier 10 are more about brawling. And so in particular, I wanted to point out the mobility of these tanks, and they are reasonably mobile when you look at the specific power. I mean, not, let's also compare the 50B just for funsies. Okay. And so if we look at the 50B for funsies, right, it ends up being a much faster tank. But again, I think my point here is that these French heavies are not like super slow. So that's something to keep in mind, even though they do have pretty good armor. Okay, and then other than a few cosmetic changes, that's about it for the substantive tank changes in this upcoming patch. So I hope that was helpful, and if you have any questions, certainly feel free to ask. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and I will see you guys out there.